panel today, or our set of presentations today, is on the theme of overcoming challenges to collaboration and looking particularly at innovative agreements and partnership arrangements. And so what we have here is, our purpose is to highlight some of the legal and institutional challenges with implementing the Tri-Council Policy Statement version 2 in academic and other Indigenous research contexts, exploring how TCPS 2 principles can guide collaborative research in organizations not bound by Tri-Council policy, and examining some innovative solutions. So we're looking at a whole mixture here of university, non-university, different and partnership kind of contexts. And we're going to have a set of presentations. Catherine's going to take a little bit longer. She gets more than 12 minutes, although she said that she can do it in 12. She gets 15. Because she's going to lay some groundwork, and Catherine's done a lot of preparatory work. She's doing some analysis and looking at agreements and different tools, and so she's going to lay a bit of a foundation for this set of presentations. And then the others, or at least Pierre, Eva, Deanna, and Craig, they've agreed to come forward and bring some concrete lived examples of these from diverse perspectives of these different kinds of agreements and partnership arrangements. And then Nicole, who comes from a nonprofit background, is she's our discussant, and she's also going to talk, tie this together and take us into an introduction into one of the breakout sessions that she's going to continue with afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine. And Catherine's talk is Legal Context for Implementing Ethical Aspirations in Tri-Council Policy Statement.
Thanks, Kelly. I also want to begin with others who have spoken before me to thank the Musqueam and Coast Salish peoples for such a warm welcome to this beautiful territory. And I also want to acknowledge my teachers, some that I've just met over these last couple of days, like Florence, and the ones I haven't met yet, and some who have passed before me who have been mentioned over the last couple of days, like Harold Cardinal and Sam Bull and some of the other wonderful people. And one of the reasons I want to mention them is because they really encouraged me as a young scholar when I started working in this area in 1980 to think really critically about Canadian law and to ask questions about how can we mobilize Canadian law to respect Indigenous rights and to recognize Indigenous laws. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit today in the context of my talk. And what I'm going to share with you today is just a really snapshot of a larger research project that Rebecca Ratcliffe and I are doing with respect to the legal context for collaborative research. Our concept of law that we're adopting is one that includes both Western and Indigenous legal traditions, and it recognizes that law is expressed in many forms and exists independently of formal state recognition. And although many academic institutions and the Tri-Council seek to respect Indigenous legal traditions, institutional norms and a range of Canadian laws, they create constraints for us and they create challenges. And what our project seeks to do is to identify what some of those constraints are and how can we use Western legal tools to try and get past some of those constraints. So we're looking at a variety of different sources in our research. But today what I'm going to share with you are themes that are derived from a number of sources that we have looked at, institutional policies and research collaborative agreements. And I'll leave the more detailed slides, of course, for conference participants. So the first theme that I want to share with you that comes out of this research, there it is the continuum of legal ethical obligations. When considering the interface of ethical and legal obligations, academic institutions tend to place research on a continuum that ranges from research involving resources about or from Aboriginal peoples to research involving Aboriginal peoples themselves. These approaches also understand collaborative research on a spectrum of community engagement to be negotiated by the parties that can range from informing and consenting through to equal and active participation. In the middle of the research continuum is research involving cultural items or information available to the public or on traditional territories of an Indigenous people, not recognized as within their legal control under Canadian law, but considered central to their ongoing traditions and subject to their Indigenous legal traditions. The more we move to the right-hand side of this spectrum, the more Indigenous and Western legal regimes become interwoven. For example, in this zone there is a clear academic, ethical, and frequent corresponding legal obligation to seek to identify the laws and the protocols of Aboriginal authorities. The obligation to respect Indigenous laws flows in Canadian law when research occurs with individuals or resources located on lands within the jurisdiction of Aboriginal governments. Legal obligations may also flow from Aboriginal and treaty rights to land, heritage sites, and other forms of cultural heritage. These legal obligations are also respected in international human rights law, but sadly Canada only sees aspirations such as free, informed, and prior consent and Indigenous control over their heritage as aspirational and not legally binding at the international level. Not surprising, in this space on the right-hand side of the continuum, what we see are more research relationships documented through guidelines and protocols. And we're going to look at some wonderful examples of those documented examples of guidelines and protocols today. Although I find it helpful to think in terms of this kind of a continuum, in some contexts, the problem I have is the line between ethical and legal obligation is blurred in the context of long-term personal relationships. And quite frankly, it disappears altogether in many instances when we focus on Indigenous teachings and laws. This raises a sticky issue, and that what is the legal obligation on the researcher here to identify and comply with Indigenous law when, from the perspective of a current or former research partner, the research involves them or their traditional knowledge, even though it is publicly available. In these situations, I find it helpful to think of ethical and legal obligations in terms of self and self-determination. That is, the context of self-responsibility and ethical action in my personal and long-term research relationships, and Indigenous self-determination, which is at the core of the Indigenous laws and codes of ethics that I work with concerning traditional knowledge. This takes me to the next theme, and that is, in order to understand fully the terms of the collaborative research arrangements that we are looking at, it is important to have agreement on and understanding of the underlying interests that inform that legal relationship. Understanding these interests help to see why respect and reciprocity in research relationships means more than addressing issues of free, informed consent and intellectual property concerns, although these are very significant. For example, with the Tronda First Nation with whom I work, key in any research relationship they enter is recognition of traditional knowledge as living knowledge and the importance of processes and outcomes that generate more lived experience of traditional knowledge in the community. They will not enter an agreement unless funds must also support more than developing written text because traditional knowledge loses its integrity and is diminished if it is extracted to text without attention being paid to supporting present and future knowledge holders. At the most fundamental level, with most of the Indigenous peoples I've worked with in Canada and elsewhere, control over traditional knowledge is about self-determination. It's about recognition and respect for autonomous peoples who have their own laws and traditions with respect to their traditional knowledge. As with principles of Canadian constitutional law, such as the principle of equality, core Indigenous legal principles such as respect, reciprocity, caring, and inclusiveness are aimed at establishing conditions necessary to live in harmony. However, these are not just standalone principles. As Indigenous legal scholar Val Napoleon explains, every Indigenous legal tradition has nuanced and robust understandings of what implementation of these principles entails in different factual contexts, such as research with traditional knowledge. This takes me to the next theme, and that is much of contracting and other instruments used to structure collaborative research relationships generated by Western academic institutions are content-heavy and pay insufficient attention to the relationship. This is a deficiency from both Western and Indigenous legal perspectives. Indigenous legal principles are relationship and action-oriented. For example, at a recent conference I attended a few weeks ago in Winnipeg, Elder Margaret Lavely interpreted the concept of informed consent in Ojibwe as how to know how to lead a good life. I found that really instructive. From a Western legal perspective, however, this is also very important because a broad purposive context is the factual matrix within which we interpret our contractual terms. Focusing on relationship, I think, becomes increasingly important in research collaborations in light of the more fulsome understanding of consent as not just prior and informed, but also progressive and ongoing. A unique example that I recently learned about that was influenced by one of the CURE projects that we're going to hear about today, that focuses solely on relationship and is grounded in Indigenous language and teachings, is an agreement between the University of Victoria and the Saanich School Board. I don't have time to go into this agreement in detail, but it is unique as it is organized around Indigenous teachings and language. It is relationship focused, and it expressly acknowledges Indigenous laws, and the University of Victoria undertakes to make its best efforts to comply with Indigenous traditional and property laws. However, this agreement does not say that it's legally binding and enforceable in Canadian courts. What it does do is anticipate more content-specific contracts to be signed in the future. Another important key in sustaining relationships is a process of dispute resolution for when disagreements arise and relationships break down. However, in the various agreements that I have reviewed, the issue of dispute resolution is rarely addressed. The University of Victoria example also brings to mind the fourth theme that has emerged from my review of legal arrangements, and that is the importance of language, words, and explanations in constructing legal relationships. For example, words like own, publish, author, copyright often do not have a language equivalent, and they must be explored and they must be defined in Indigenous legal terminology. The next theme that I want to bring to your attention is the theme that relates to the practical limits of legal protections and the instruments that we use. There are a range of tools that are typically contained in research agreements and consent forms many of us here are familiar with. With a little bit of time here, what I want to do is focus on the relationship between copyright and confidentiality. Copyright is an incentive-based notion that provides economic benefits rather than protection, but it can be used to achieve protection goals as it enables the owner of the copyright to control dissemination of that work and derive economic benefits from its reproduction and distribution for a limited period of time. For these reasons, tools for implementing copyright, such as license agreements, can facilitate management in ways that are very culturally appropriate, and we may hear some creative examples of that today from one of the CURE projects. However, copyright does not preclude others from using the information, just the form within which it is embodied. Because of the distinction between copyright and information, parties need to discuss from the outset what kinds of Indigenous knowledge issues are involved and how to address confidentiality of information in a range of different contexts. Institutional policies and contracts with granting agencies can have serious implications here, such as limiting the ability of researchers to destroy publicly funded data and confidentiality clauses that are so broad they can prevent all forms of publication. Of particular concern in all research agreements that we have reviewed is use of special or sensitive information. There are three main strategies that are used here to protect sensitive and sacred information. And I'll just speak to one of them that is up here and leave my slides for later. One of them is to agree processes for review and validation will be done by the appropriate First Nation, Inuit, or Métis authority to advise participants of the process what will be followed, and to discuss potential risks of inadvertent actions of disclosure. In my view, this idea of dual validation, one which Marlene initiated some time ago, is key and assists with the challenges that we talked about yesterday about inadequate representation on research ethics boards. This is because when we have dual rigorous validation within Indigenous and Western systems, such as peer review on one side and review on First Nation on the other, what we're going to get in the end is a fine quality intercultural product from which everybody can benefit, but it is a very time-consuming process. There are many other issues that are around confidentiality that I can't get into, But I want to mention with respect to digital information, promising confidentiality has now become a very sticky issue. Digitized environments create new challenges because of the inability to guarantee safety of the digital record. The sixth theme I want to talk about, and I'm just going to go through two of them quickly here, is the need to re-examine institutional policies and contractual relationships that are grounded in old hierarchies of knowledge, governance, and ethics. Within this theme, several issues are emerging relating to a range of policies and processes, including administration of research funds, assessment of meritorious activities, policy on academic integrity and research dissemination, and lack of institutional support for faculty seeking to follow ethical practice. And I've listed some of the sticky issues up here that arise in that context. I do, however, want to take time to make it to my final theme, but before I do, I want to say again, in my work with Yukon First Nations and others, a critique that continually arises is this idea and the need to decolonize financial administration. Several issues have come up in this context, including choice of law provisions that force dispute resolution into Canadian courts rather than through alternative processes, and overly burdensome financial reporting requirements. Another sticky issue relates to payment of elders in terms of methods, requirements, and amounts, and the failure to recognize that Indigenous peoples are already experts by virtue of their knowledge. So this then takes me to the last theme, and that is the challenges of maintaining ongoing consent. A theme emerging here is consent is free, informed, prior, and process is difficult to achieve without sufficient institutional and financial support and flexibility to enable fulsome discussion. It is true, and here I just want to talk about consent forms to conclude, but I'm not going to reduce the issue to one of consent forms. It is true that some legal instruments that are required to comply with implementation of ethical obligations have at their core liability interests of researchers, their employers, but it is equally false to say that this is the only or predominant interest. This was recently demonstrated in the Luke Magnotta case. The ability to demonstrate communication originated in confidence and that the identity of participants would not be revealed was central in an application by two criminology law professors to quash a warrant for them to hand over tapes of interviews they conducted with accused murderer Luke Magnotta. However, this story also brings to light again the disconnect that sometimes exists between institutional support and tri-council aspirations. The study received approval of the university's Research Ethics Board, but the university did not agree to pay the legal costs. We're currently looking at the terms of those confidentiality clauses now, but we have discovered in looking at some institutional policies that we have reviewed that if the principal investigator has indicated that confidentiality is limited by law, the institution will support them in a legal battle. But if they say confidentiality will apply regardless of the law, the institution says maybe they will not. So these are very important and challenging questions. And these forms, although they demonstrate the importance of contracting confidentiality, they still leave us with a very sticky issue, which is how do we find the balance of not enough and too much detail in consent forms, which continually remains a sticky issue for those of us who work in collaborative research. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Kathy. That was brilliant. There was so much there, and I'm really grateful that you agreed to be videotaped so that we can share your talk again and again with those who will want to go back. A great reference for us. Just wanted to mention that the collaboration agreement from UVic that Kathy used as an example, I had the privilege of being in a workshop at UVic a couple weeks ago where it was presented, and they were actually invited to present here, but nobody could make it. But Ravina Thomas, who was one of the people there who was involved in the agreement in the Indigenous Affairs Office, described it as something that really struck me. She said, what makes this agreement different is that it's not about what we're going to do together. It's about how we're going to be together. And so that was the foundation of that agreement. And I hope they could come, and they could have, but that was profound for me, for an institution to make that kind of commitment. And I'm really excited to see how it plays out over the coming days and months and years. So thank you, Catherine. And we're going to move now to Pierre Haddad, who is going to introduce us to a project that he's been working on with Alain Courier and many others. Ethical considerations and challenges when combining Indigenous traditional medicine and evidence-based biomedical science. And Pierre has a wonderful story to share. So, Pierre.
Works. So I'll move over here to be interacting with my own presentation and yourself.
Alrighty.
Make it things a little different. No, I'll just wave. That's fine. Thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very humbled to be in a room with so many great minds and hearts. And I'll share a little story. I think I'm probably the only basic scientist in the room, but well, with Alain, and we'll share this story. First of all, I'd like to dedicate the talk to the memory of all elders who have passed in the course of the project, unfortunately. So yeah, I guess I'll have to ask you to change slides. So just to situate ourselves, we're working with the Cree in the Eastern James Bay area. There are 9 communities, and 6 of them have signed on to the agreement. There are about 15,000 individuals in this community. Next slide, please. We're dealing with diabetes, which is a life-threatening and a very debilitating disease. And if you see the statistics about 40 years ago, there was hardly any, and you see that it's ramped up quite impressively over the years. And that's, of course, due to rapid changes in living and eating habits, and we can deal with that in the question or later in the interaction period. Next slide just shows that the prevalence of diabetes is about 3 to 5 times in the Cree population than it is in the rest of the Quebec population. And the next bit is if you adjust for age, there's almost 1 in 3 adults in the Cree communities that is suffering from diabetes. So it's a very urgent situation to deal with. And so the next slide shows our approach. We built this team, and of course you see that it's centered on the Cree Nations, their traditional knowledge and their medicinal plants, and purposely the arrows are going back and forth at every step of the way because we really tried very hard and I think succeeded in giving the elders and the healers a central role in the project and be able to interact at every step of the way, although that was challenging in many cases. So I won't have time to go into the detail, but just to let you know that Alain is taking care of the ethnobotany, which is actually accessing the traditional knowledge to identify plants with anti-diabetic potential. Then we look at the chemistry with Dr. Arneson at the University of Ottawa. So it's 3 major Canadian universities are involved here, 7 labs. So it's quite the challenge. Pharmacology is under my supervision and involves all 3 universities. Of course, the elders and the clinicians in this study advise us to be careful with toxicology. So we have someone there. Nutrition, of course, for diabetes is important. We even have some clinical trials. I won't be able to give you the details, but I'm happy to share anything in the discussion period. And finally, the Cree Health Board is involved in what we call education and integration, so pursuing the traditional knowledge and trying to improve access to traditional medicine within the healthcare system. Next slide. So a bit of the project flow so you get a sense of what we're doing, and then I'll get into the research agreement itself. We scanned then the knowledge of the elders to identify potentially anti-diabetic plants. For all of these, the phytochemist prepares extracts. We do in vitro assays, and I won't have time to go into this, but to identify for all species their potential. And then for the ones that have activity, we go deeper into the mechanisms of action, use animal data, animal models to confirm this, and then also isolate. This is where some elders have had issues with isolating active principles because that denatures a bit the traditional medicine, but that's not our aim at all. It's not to make modern drugs out of the traditional medicines, but it's more to get to a standardized or a quality control type of activity. So the aim is to get to these, if it's scaled up, the use of traditional medicines, then of course you need some form of control for the population who's using it. And right now the quality of the healers is what the quality control, but we're adding tools with chemical and biological activity that can be used. Next slide. So I wanted just to share also this this exercise that we did with the healers to try to explain to them how we would prioritize plants on the basis of our results, either in the animals, in the cells, and other side effects of whether they're safe to use and antioxidant, anti-inflammatory activity. So of course the more smiley faces higher up on the left, the more priority we would give to a plant. And then we said, okay, this is our worldview now from your own worldview. And of course then they would talk about the respect they have for the plant and the interaction, the experience they have. But just look at this elders ranking and you see that out of the top 6 plants that we prioritized, 4 were the same. Maybe the order is not so important, but that just talks to the convergence of the sciences, the Aboriginal traditional knowledge on one side and the modern biomedical sciences on the other. So I find that gives me goosebumps actually when this happens. Next slide. So let's get into what interests all of us here. Actually things are made easy for me because the groundwork has been laid and you are all experts on this, so I won't have to go into details. But essentially the best approach, as Kathy said, is to have a good agreement because the laws and the legal background, the legal environment is not so protective for traditional knowledge. So let me talk to you about a bit this agreement that we set up. Next slide. First of all, the concerns of the communities and the community members, so safety issues to make sure that traditional medicine is used properly and in a supervised way. It's a bit like the natural health products that the pharmacists have asked to be behind the counter, so at least you have to interact with a professional to self-medicate if you want. They don't want people to do harm to themselves. There was a whole question of the partnership, how we would detail the collaborative research. Of course, the protection of the traditional knowledge so that it's not used without consent, and the ownership of the intellectual property. So the parties to this agreement are the 6 communities that I mentioned earlier, the Cree Board of Health and Social Services, the 3 universities, and we also have a university hospital that participates from the Université de Montréal. These are the 5 major principles, and these will ring bells to all of you, so I'll take one at a time to give you at least the details of how practically we dealt with them. So confidentiality, of course, is a given for the traditional medicine, and we use prior informed consent at all the different levels, of course. What's interesting is what Kathy did mention is the need to get consent from the communities for publishing, and I will give you, we have a quite interesting process that we put into effect. And also the fact that protection of traditional knowledge takes precedence over academic freedom in a way in this agreement, because we have to go back. Right now the project is unfortunately ended, but if I want to continue working on the plants that we've been working for, I still have to go back to the communities and ask for consent to continue the research. Next slide. So let's talk about this review of publication. Of course, this is publicly funded research, so publication, and in a sense research in general, if it's kept in a box, it's not very useful. The idea is to share the results, but you have to do this in a way that doesn't disclose traditional knowledge in an appropriate way. So the solution we found was to have what we call a formal review process, where we summarized and translated into Cree the results of the studies, and then the elders got some time to review, and then we had some comments and extraction of traditional knowledge if there was any necessity for that. So the next slide just illustrates the sort of flowchart on the decision, and this I won't go into detail because it's in the research agreement. I have about 20 copies that are in the table in the other room available for people who are interested. and it's also online on our website, so you can access this easily. But there's just a go, no go, where to go, how to travel the process. Next slide is the actual process itself. So you see that it goes about 3 months before, 13 weeks before the actual submission to an article, to a journal. So that can be quite, the longest it took when we put this process in place is 1 year with my own student, my own master's student. So you have to be patient and develop the process with the others because they've never done this before. Next slide, and I see the yellow thing. So, but I think we'll get through. So in terms of the collaborative research, we've of course acted with very much respect and transparency. We've had regular meetings every 6 months, and we've prepared documents to share the results of the study. We had acknowledgements of the elders in all of the publications, and we really made a point of making a link between everything that we published and the traditional knowledge, so that we can discuss this later. And the communities were involved in all stages, and I'm quite an open-minded researcher, but when they started talking about participating in the interpretation of the results, I was a bit taken aback, but Alain and I did do a lot of exercises with them, and it's amazing how much this was very wonderful to do that, and they've actually contributed a lot. I have a lot of anecdotes to share in the following session. Next slide. So the joint intellectual property, of course, we wouldn't have been able to do this without the traditional knowledge, but also without the scientific knowledge. So it's a joint joint intellectual property. The others see themselves as custodians much more than owners of the traditional knowledge, and they have a role to play in protecting it. So I won't go into the details of this, but a lot of you know a lot about this. So next slide is how we actually dealt with this, is to have this shared intellectual property, and then we have co-authors. We considered about patenting, but it's not very well suited, but we did the exercise of sitting the elders down and explaining to them how this would be. And there's consent from both the researchers and the universities, and 50+1% ownership of the, so an elegant way to end. Next slide is the benefit sharing. I'm almost done, so it's not such a difficult thing. We've really created a project where there's a lot of interaction, so there's place for jobs, for herbaria, for training. We've had some apprenticeships programs, and if there was commercialization possible, then they suggested we create a non-profit organization which would manage any potential commercial outcomes. And the revenues, this is very interesting, would be for preserving the traditional knowledge, the passing on of that, and including it into healthcare. And what was very interesting, and this didn't come from us, it came from them, but to further do some studies of the same types that we're doing together with them. So one last little bit that I wanted to share is a gesture of respect for Sam Awashish. Unfortunately, he passed away in a tragic accident, and when you discover new compounds, you can give them a common name. There's the chemical name, but we call them this one awashishinic acid in respect for the Awashish family. So they were very touched, and so that's all I have to say. The rest of the slides are just the thank yous, and I thank you for your attention.
And one thing that Pierre did not share, which we can talk more about in the breakout, is he put his 19 slides into 12 or 13 minutes in a brilliant way, and he condensed a whole bunch of innovation and experience in that. But I believe his first CHR grant might have been a 3-year grant or something, the first one. And I think the time it took to develop the agreement, the grant ended before the agreement was in place. They got a second grant, I think maybe a 5-year grant.
Yeah.
And so then how many years into the 5-year grant did you finally get the agreement for the 3-year grant?
2 years.
So,
5 years long.
so what he didn't tell you was the absolute dedication and transformation that happened to him and the whole team and the way that they worked together. And for a pharmacologist, that's a person who sits in the lab and extracts and denatures. And so I was there, that's what I did. And this is a huge leap, and I'm just so grateful for Pierre and his openness and the journey that he's taken, and that he's also putting this back into the hardcore science, laboratory science, and finding a different path. So thank you, Pierre, for joining us. Next, I'd like to invite Eva and Deanna to give their example of taking responsibility, building relationship in the Coast Salish way.
OCMCI at Newton. Exactly. By what the Smith, can eat it at Appleton and so Cowton and so Scottmish. At Zappo area. Good morning. In my Hulkamina language, I introduce myself as Kwaiwat, and my non-traditional name is Deanna Daniels. I am from, my traditional heritage is Coast Salish from Pakwachin, which is a Saanich Peninsula nation, and Cowichan and Squamish here in this territory. My mother told me a story when she lived here in this territory, when she was a very young child, that she lived in the Stanley Park and played there. So it's a special place for me. I'm really happy to present with Eva, my friend, our Cura project, our unique project. The title is Taking Responsibility and Building Relationships in a Coast Salish Way. We had a management team for the whole entire project, which was unique to the project. Eva was the director, we had a steering committee, we had co-investigators, and we had coordinators for the team, for the projects. Why it was unique because it was so large. You think of 5 partners in a project with 2 communities, a university, and 2 Aboriginal organizations in a collaborative effort. You can imagine what mountains we had to climb and how many streams we had to tread to get this project done, and we did. So in the Saanich Heritage Community, in the Saanich community there were 4 communities, and in the Hulkamina area there were 6 communities. And you think about what the language situation was in that time. We were in a critical state of emergency, all our languages. In the Saanich community we had about 20 language speakers, and right now it's less than a handful. And in the Hulkamina there were probably 120, and I'm sure that's decreased as well at the time. The Cura project length was 5 years for the funding part, but it lasted 8 years from day 1 to the project report. The project was initiated from the communities themselves. They came to the university and said, we want to have a language revitalization project. My language is important to me, and we need to get something done. So they went to the university. So some key players, some of them already had plans. They had goals and what they wanted to do for language. What the project outcomes for the Cure project, there were 10 Hulkamina documentation projects, 9 Senchothan projects. There was governance and intellectual property projects, linguistic issues and methodology projects, 2 types of results that were tangible and intangible. The purpose of the Cura project, to contribute to rebuilding a living language in the heritage in the Hulkamina and Senchothan communities, to produce language research and materials to build capacity and research, culture and protocol. The research was relevant to language revitalizations, ones that were useful to both the communities, and research was done in the communities and in the university to establish solid partnerships between the Coast Salish communities and UVic. What was important was that we learned more about how we work together, respecting culture, protocol, and our own worldview, to enable conditions that would allow revitalization to continue after this project. These are the initial guiding principles through the application process, where principles of respect associated with benefit to the community, governance, management, equality, sharing ownership of the research, and control, ensuring control is exercised.
There are so many things that we could talk about with this project. Living through it was a transformative and an intense experience. So we prepared a handout because we were finding it hard to choose what to say, and it has some of the reflections from our team on the process. It's on the tables. But what we're doing today is just talking about the project at the macro level, because what we wanted to do was to enable as much as possible the ability to work well together and to take responsibility for and affect change amongst ourselves as a team, and within all of the partner communities, and especially at the university. And in this way to move language revitalization forward. And one key element of our work was practicing meaningful consultation. So the project was structured to allow us to respect the knowledge and heritage of Sinchothan and Halkamenim communities and to make sure that they benefited. Marlo Page, who was one of the coordinators of the project, said that community-based research is not about the researcher, it is about the community and its ideas. It is the people letting you participate in their lives, because it is their lives you are taking from. And it also might be useful for you to know that our project was the first language revitalization cura, so we didn't have any models for it. So the first guiding principle was that the communities should benefit from training and employment opportunities generated by the research. And so how we tried to do that was, from very early on, we decided to hire as many people as we possibly could in as many different capacities as possible. So there were research assistants, there were research participants, teachers, advisors, but one of the most important things that we did was that we tried to shift the idea of what the roles were on the project. And so we were very conscious about thinking about elders and community participants as researchers and as leaders of the research projects. And so that also had implications for how we compensated them. There was a lot of discussion at the university about making sure that the elders were compensated adequately, equivalently to being researchers. We also had principles about Sinchothan and Halkamenim having equal, although not necessarily identical status, that the research should be managed and evaluated jointly, and that the community should have direct input into developing and defining research practices and projects related to them. So these were principles that we set up in the application process. And so our guiding principles were put into effect through both the governance structure and the management structure that we worked out. So there were 2 elders advisory boards, one for each of the language communities. And the elders provided direction and guidance for the project and for individual projects. And one of the elders on the HTG side was Florence James, who provided, as we all know already, very, very important guidance. There was also a steering committee, and the partners, it was equally distributed amongst all of the partners. And there was an elected chair, and Deanna Daniels was the elected chair. And then the steering committee provided senior leadership, and it was responsible for business and research issues, for the project vision, for community needs, for knowledge mobilization, and for university and granting agency. And then we had a governance structure. And here there was the director of the PI, and then there was the whole project coordinator, and then coordinators for each of the language sides. And the most important role of the management team was translation and mediation between the university and the community partners. Very early on, the Sinchothan elders asked Andy Paul, who was the Sinchothan coordinator, so what do they do over there at UVic anyway? And so what we did in response to that was we added a university facilitator. And the university facilitator and the community coordinator would meet regularly, once a week, to talk about what was going on both at the university and at the community, and to kind of act together as a bridge between the community and the university. And with all of this structure, we also had to think very carefully about who was going to talk to whom, when, where, how, why. So we had, as you can see, we developed lines of communication, and we modeled it as well. And then we also spelled out policies and procedures in terms of reference for the roles in order to ensure transparency and just to make sure that we all understood how to proceed.
I think guiding principles were making sure there was direct input by the, with developing research practices and projects. Sorry. Of course, there were community concerns about sensitive information, so we made sure that was protected under this as well. There was really cultural and private things that public did not see. They wanted to have that covered. In practice, about ownership and control. Catherine talked about the MOU, and all I want to say was that without that, we wouldn't have been able to carry on. Knowing that document was there to safeguard them, we were able to move on. What we learned about practice in the Coast Salish Way, with emphasis on the Coast Salish Way, was the importance of building relationships and collaboration, facilitating community ownership and control, valuing the roles of elders. And I want to stop there a little bit about the elders. We had a lot of discussion about this, and we know and acknowledge the elders that they were the knowledge keepers of their language. They had all the wisdom, and we need to acknowledge them as the researchers as well. So we're developing ways of meaningful consultation, building infrastructure in the community and the university, taking responsibility to change. What we learned about practice in the Coast Salish Way was needing to find ways to work at a community pace, providing time, a sense of security and purpose, creating a safe place for talking about language and about the work together. We needed to acknowledge our participation in a language-related work that had the power to affect the well-being and heal guilt associated with language loss, respect cultural differences of all the parties, including the university, and have compassion for ourselves and for each other, because we were working in a good way and in a pace that the community wanted to. So in ending, I wanted to, this is actually my statement that I made in the report. I'm very proud of it. The cure goes to show that you can do a project that's institutional and make it work for you.
Thank you, Eva and Deanna. Something that you can perhaps get into in the breakout session is the agreements themselves, and I wanted to make 2 points. This Kira short project took place in the early 2000s, quite a long time ago. Research ethics and institutional capacity for embracing this kind of a project was not there. These people are path breakers in that way, just like Pierre's and his group. And the other thing is that they actually had the capacity to really take a look at the laws, copyright laws, for example, and come up with a research agreement, the memorandum of understanding and the research agreement that followed, that actually did what Catherine was talking about, married the ethics and the law, at least in the Western sense, and they were able to establish right in their agreements where some of those boundaries are, and have clarity about the boundaries and the ownership of certain kinds of knowledge. And it's a very, very innovative agreement that they came up with. I don't know how it stands up today in 2014, but I still consider it one of the most innovative research agreements I've seen that has dealt with copyright law directly. So thank you for sharing that with us. Next, I want to invite Craig Paskin from the Ktunaxa Nation Council, and he's going to talk about another interesting journey from a community perspective. Ktunaxa Research Ethics Policy in the Making, and I think this is not a short story or a short process.
Well, first off, I'd like to say that I'm honored to be welcomed to Coast Salish territory, and I'm also honored to work with the Tanaka Nation Council. Oh, here we are. I just wanted to say that I come from the perspective of a staff person for the Tanaka Nation Council. I'm not here to voice the values of the Tanaka Nation themselves, so I come as a staff person or a bureaucrat. So I come here not as an expert in research ethics. That's why we hired Kelly to help us with our research policy development, and she did a really great job. She was very helpful, very supportive, and very committed to the whole process. I do have to work in policy development. Part of the things that I do, definitely research ethics touches upon. So we have to deal with it both externally and internally, as it influences all subsequent policy development. For example, around things like our honorary policy that we're working on, we want to ensure that honorary policy is, or honorary, what we pay, is consistently applied, so we either aren't overpriced or, and fundamentally we also want, and I will emphasize this, is that we want to create a positive culture of research. The Tanaka Nation, which is located in the southeast corner of BC, has a very small population of about 1,500, and very few, a handful, know the language, and we have very limited number of knowledge keepers, so we don't want to cause them fatigue in the things that we are constantly asking of them. So as a staff person, I come from the perspective of trying to help the nation rebuild its governance and trying to incorporate values into those policy statements. I will never understand the culture of the Tanaka Nation, but what I like to say is that I understand that it's important. Oops. So, our research journey, and Kelly was alluded to the fact that it's been an incredibly long one. A few years ago, a report landed on my desk from a university about climate change. I had no idea where it came from, and although it was within the mandate of the land sector, which I work within, the Tanaka Nation Council were asked to ratify this report, but we were never asked to help develop the research parameters. The researchers were engaged with one of the communities of the nation, but this is a nation-level issue that was being addressed in the research report. It took a significant amount of time for me to review this document, and Kelly probably remembers that every page was stickied extensively. There was lots of issues with it. It took an extensive amount of my time and effort to review it, only to find out in the end that it really was absolutely no value to the Tanaka Nation. It kind of shocked me that this kind of stuff still goes on. It didn't ask the right questions for us. Its recommendations were too generic to be of any value. These recommendations, as you can see, could be applied to most research topics. And the Tanaka Nation Council strives to do all these things in all cases. Those were basically the recommendations that came from that report, to consult the elders, to get the youth involved. Very generic, nothing in relation to climate change. When I talked with the researcher about these issues, the response was very defensive. I got the impression that they were not interested in listening to the comments that we had to make, or basically they didn't want to change the report because of funding deadlines, and they had to get the report out. More problematic was the notion that the researcher was giving voice to the Tanaka Nation. I found that offensive. I can only imagine what the Tanaka felt themselves. The KNC does not need its voice given to them. This is not an issue of voice, but rather your priorities are not our priorities. We have different research interests. Much of what we do is around rights and title, and we need to concentrate on that. This is a good example of a bad research process for us, but what it did do was give us a real good kick to get our act together and develop a policy that works for us as well as for others. We do have an old research ethics policy. It was written back in 1998, but it was written at a time prior to the Tanaka Nation Council having its current governance structure, and we have several sector councils. I work within the Lands and Resource Council. There's an economic sector, there's a social sector, there's a traditional knowledge and language sector as well. It hasn't been reviewed since 1998. It's definitely out of date, and it's definitely not current with contemporary standards. And it had too little detail in providing direction in developing research agreements. And it was too onerous in decision making. It required the approval from the Tanaka Nation Council, from the Treaty Council, and from the Elders Council. So the issues that we wanted to address, we're aware that external research can impact our internal research needs and limit our options. This can result in research fatigue of communities as well as of individuals. There can also be an impact on staff time and resources and take away from our own priorities. And as I mentioned, researchers' priorities are not necessarily our priorities, and we need to balance that out. So with the new research ethics policy, which Kelly helped us to develop, we established some guiding parameters, and these included the need to protect and respect Tanaka culture and values, reflect the current standards of the day, reflect the needs of current governance, simplify the review and approval process. It can be quite onerous to staff and communities. We wanted to ensure that there's consistency in the review of research proposals, and we wanted to encourage, again, we have to emphasize this is that we want to encourage a positive culture of research. If there's a negative feeling about research within the communities and individuals, we jeopardize our own research internal needs. And last but not least, we want to engender or create good relationships with outside interests. So we have a stepped approach to developing, not a stepped approach to developing a policy, but the policy itself is a staged approach. It's to aid our thinking, assessment, review, and approval of research, and we developed that stepped approach at which any point we can say no. So this is about saying no to outside researchers. So the overall purposes of the new policy is to support a positive culture of research. Again, I really want to emphasize this. This is very important to us. We want to ensure our priorities are met. And we want to ensure appropriate respect and protection is afforded to Tanaka culture and values, and that this policy applies to external research. We are developing a policy to guide internal research. We see them as separate, and that the researchers need to know this policy before submitting an application. So the next step is a research synopsis. This is a form that can be downloadable. We are requesting a summary of the proposed research in plain language. In other words, don't copy and paste from your research application or funding proposals. We want to understand what you're talking about. This allows our first decision point, yes or no. We may be not interested because it's not our priority. We may be interested, but don't have the staff time or the resources to contribute. We may be interested, and if so, we'll invite you to the next stage. So the third stage is the application form itself. If the researcher is successful, they'll be invited. Nobody else can get to this stage. It won't be downloadable, but it has a comprehensive list of questions that guide the researcher and ensure that all aspects of the policy are addressed. And that will lead to the agreement. If their answers are acceptable, what's in the application form will form the agreement between the Tanaka and the researchers. It's a social contract. It confirms our mutual expectations and commitments. And then next steps, well, the policy and procedure still needs to be ratified. It takes a long time to get draft off the policy statements. A research ethics board is being developed. We need to clarify who is responsible for each stage. I tend to think that the directors should be responsible for ratifying the direction of the research because there are resources and time and funding that may need to be allocated of staff, and they have a better idea of what their sector needs are. The Research Ethics Board can review the detailed application to ensure that the ethical considerations are fully incorporated. We need to figure out who signs the final agreement. We do have a new central chief administrative officer, something completely new to the nation. So that's a possibility. We need to assess if we need that many questions in our application in order for staff to reach a decision. And we need to monitor and evaluate to see if the policy meets our needs, and we need to revise it accordingly. And to end on an elegant note, hopefully we all live happily ever after.
Thank you, Craig, and it has been a great privilege to be involved in that work. We're going to end with Nicole Allen, and we're going to run a little bit late, but Nicole will be quick. Challenges and strategies for building ethical space and diverse stakeholder collaborations. And after Nicole's presentation, we'll break. Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you, Kelly, and John, you know I'm colorblind, right? So nothing to me. So
rare female colorblind. Very suspicious.
So I'd just like to begin, as my fellow panelists did, of recognizing, acknowledging, and thanking the Musqueam and Coast Salish people for inviting us to be here today and have this wonderful gathering and event and conversation. I also wanted to thank my fellow panelists for really terrific and inspiring, I think, presentations about some of the examples and innovative things you can do when you're committed and passionate about the project. I also want to tell you that somewhere in this presentation there is a unicorn picture. I know I'm in the last session, so look for it, be ready for it, and I'll try to be quick. So my job is difficult. I'm supposed to be both discussant, but I also wanted to share a little bit with you about what I do, what I have to kind of negotiate, and what my challenges are at a not-for-profit that lives at a university, but has its own money, its own governance, but many of those people doing the governance are university researchers. I also work in the field primarily of access to justice, with some projects that focus specifically on Aboriginal justice and intercultural dispute resolution. One of the challenges that I face often is that I don't get to stand in front of a group that is so well versed and such deep thinkers really on issues related to Indigenous values, pedagogy, methodologies, and research. Many of the people I work with have no clue that these things even exist, yet are partnering on these projects in various ways and are key stakeholders with communities that have been doing a lot of work and a lot of thinking on these areas. So my challenge is often to try to find a way to get them to speak to each other and come to this place of ethical space that we've been talking about over the last few days. So now I get to use this, and Catherine, maybe you'll have to show me too. Oh, there we go. Okay. So what I want to do is hopefully talk to you a bit about the idea of complex problems and why I think that the kind of discussions we're having today, the question of ethical space is actually a complex problem. And then I want to introduce a framework, a social lab framework that we've been using at one of my organizations to address some complex problems in the justice sector. And I thought I'd try it out with us here, introduce a new tool that maybe we could think with for the rest of the day. And then I'm going to introduce the breakout exercise. And I have a whole bunch of notes on my paper where things intersect, so I'll try to add my discussant role into there as well. So very quickly, at first glance, the idea of a complex problem seems pretty simple. We all think we know what that means, but in fact, there's distinctions to be made between what are called complicated problems and complex problems. So here in the little chart, which I did not, the reference at the bottom there, this is not mine, but simple problem, baking a cake, right? So if you have the instructions to bake a cake, and if you follow those instructions, you can probably bake a cake provided you do everything correctly. That's a simple problem. A complicated problem might be like someone sending a rocket to the moon. That's complicated. It's not easy, right? But again, if you have the right protocols, the formulas, you have the right people in place, you have the right expertise, they talk to each other correctly, you can send a rocket to the moon. It's just a little bit complicated, right? But you can, again, if we do it one time, we can probably do it successfully another time following the same route. Complex problems are not like that at all. And so the chart uses raising a child, and the first one I think says it all. Rigid protocols have limited application or are counterproductive. So I can hear all of your children laughing because you know what worked for your first child, you might as well have thrown completely out of the window for your second child and for your third child and so on. So it doesn't work to have one approach. It doesn't work to try and have a plan that you put in place and you rigidly follow because you're not going to get very far. So you also, in rearing the child, can't separate the complex from the whole. So you can't control all of the outside atmosphere when you're raising your child. So you can say no TV all you want, but when they go to their friend's house and they watch TV, well now that problem just changed, right? Your life situation, your theories around it just changed. So complex problems then are actually about relationships. Multiple actors, interests, worldviews, agendas, they all exist within the same problem. And the challenge there is that these things are always shifting, right? In response to forces we can't control, can't foresee. So again, we have to be flexible in how we think about and solve complex problems because they're unpredictable. They cut across silos, right? I think it's clear in this room the idea of ethical space and ethical research cuts across a whole lot of silos, right? And so you need those people to be talking to each other and thinking about each other. And they cannot be solved, and this is a key kind of definitional note on complex problems, they cannot be solved by a single individual or organization. You need to look at the system at a whole. So even if you even if we improved all of our university administration policies, unless we improved how communities think through these things and how SHRC thinks through these things, we're never going to get very far. So this is what complex problems actually look like, and it's really scary and messy. And I don't even have all of the bubbles and bubbles and bubbles and bubbles that actually come off all of these things. And if you imagine them moving, I imagine like when you go to those kids like Chuck E. Cheese and you have all those balls swirling in the air, right? They're all bumping against each other all different times. And so how do you actually begin to think about solving a problem like this? And while I'm inspired by all of the great examples here about the hard work and the kind of transformative and innovative solutions my fellow panelists have come up with and my own colleagues at iPinch, we seem to be cutting the same trail over and over and over and over, right? And the question is, why do we continue to have to do that? And it's because we haven't found a way yet to address this issue at a systemic level. So the complex problems framework, although it's scary to think about the problems like that, it can actually help us because it can force us to look at the whole system so that we address the systemic issues and not just the individual symptoms. So sometimes it's easy as a group to focus on those symptoms, right? It's the old iceberg. I'm glad there's scientists in these rooms because this borrows a lot from technology and design and actual scientist labs. But you look at an iceberg, right, and you only see the tip of the iceberg. You don't see all of the problems underneath. But by identifying this as a complex problem, we can start to find strategies to deal with it as a whole. But the complex problem framework also is participatory. It absolutely is fundamental in any kind of solution-based, complex problem solution-based, that there's a co-creation of a solution. So it's not consultation. I don't use that word at all. And it's not, you don't bring people in later on in the process and let them know what you've come up with. Everybody sits at the table from the beginning. And I hear a lot of resistance to this with how are we going to get everyone at the table and how are we going to do it? Well, today we've started a little bit and yesterday, but it can be done. And the most important thing perhaps about this project, I have users up there. I'm sorry, I stole these slides from another presentation at 4:30 this morning. But the users, what this means is, if you go back to our problems here, this isn't just about getting the communities, the universities, researchers, the administration, and SSHRC talking. It's about also having at the table actual graduate students, right? Actual youth from the communities. Actual people from the finance departments, not people that speak on behalf of them, but people who can let you know about their individual processes, about where they're getting stuck. Because what we know from health research in the healthcare sector is that there's a lot of knowledge lost when someone speaks on behalf of someone else, right? And so what I might think is important to a graduate student, I might have no idea about the actual thing that's holding them up. And it could be really, really big, or it could be really, really small. But unless they're included in the conversation, we don't know. Someone's reaching for a card. Oh no. Okay, so this is my integration of some of the things I've been hearing. I was really struck, Marlene, I think it was you that talked about the castle and the idea of trying to break into the castle. And this is how we generally approach complex problems. Let me in. Or alternatively, we say forget you, as you said, and we're going to build something out there in the meadow. But neither of those will work. So the point of the complex problems framework is that you need to blow it all up, right? You can't work with either of those things, and that's why we're stuck, because we keep doing and trying the same things over and over and over and over. And there's my unicorn picture. Because sometimes when I give this talk, people think this is where I live. But I promise you, I've been working with what's called a social lab, a framework that they use in the development sector sometimes, to work with this complex problems framework to try to experiment and create methods that work on these complex problems. And there's many people who have done this successfully all over the world, and we're just starting to integrate it here. So social labs, what they do is they bring together key stakeholders from across the system and not just the high-level stakeholders. So again, the users, people in the room, right down to the person who normally would never get an invite to that table. They should be there, and they should be encouraged to share every bit of their experience. We use kind of innovation methods that they use in the technology sector to, again, blow up that castle, blow up that metal, and to rethink some of the problems. One issue with these problems, we call them when we get stuck in these complex problems, is we assume we already know what the problem is. Even today, yesterday in this gathering, we've assumed we know where the issues are. And I think we all have a lot of experience and can identify those. But I wonder what would happen if we wiped the slate clean and we said, okay, let's talk about the problem a little differently. Let's do something a little bit differently about this, and I wonder if a different problem might emerge. I don't know, but that's part of the experience, is getting that divergent thinking happening. And then together you co-create solutions. And I want to be clear about this. It doesn't mean, unfortunately, Craig, that everybody lives happily ever after and gets along. What it means is that we develop empathy and we start to understand other people's interests, needs, and also constraints. And some of those constraints, it may not be possible to remove, right? But together you can find ways to work around them. Or at the very least, you now understand where your different institutions are coming from. I've got the elegant ending. And so I have to take 1 minute. So we're actually going to experiment, or I'm going to experiment with one of the techniques I sometimes use in my lab around personas. And so in the breakout room, anyone who wants to join me, we're going to be developing some of those personas. So from all those bubbles, the archetypes, as Kelly said, of who's involved, and we're going to try to start thinking and talking differently about some of the interests and needs of these people, develop outlines of the persona. Again, anyone who's worked in technology, it's how they built your iPhone, right? They developed these personas, and then later on today, we're going to run them through, hopefully either a scenario that someone shares, or I have a backup scenario that we've prepared. So if anyone is interested in that, I'd be pleased to have you, and I hope we can do some divergent thinking around this. So thank you.
Hey,